Assalamualaikum everyone. On behalf of the Mehbooba Research Center, welcome and thank you for joining us for this distinguished seminar as part of our IIMR lecture series on social justice and change. IIMR dedicated his life to challenging oppression. As a prolific journalist, he used the written word to champion the rights of women, children, and marginalized communities. As the Director and later Secretary General of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, he tirelessly confronted issues like enforced disappearances, bonded labor, and the blasphemy laws in Pakistan. This evening, we are fortunate to have Dr. Nimer Sultany, a scholar of international law at SOAS, for a seminar that will dissect the systematic oppression faced by Palestinians and the urgent need for solutions that uphold true justice and equality, ideals that deeply resonate with IIMR's legacy. We're also fortunate to be joined by Dr. Osama Siddiqui, who will moderate the session. Dr. Siddiqui is the founder and executive director of the Law and Policy Research Network, and a faculty member at the Institute of Global Law and Policy at Harvard. I request Dr. Siddiqui to formally introduce Dr. Sultany and begin the session.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank Lance, my alma mater, and an institution I have had a very long and a very sort of pleasant association. I would particularly like to thank Dr. Ali Chima, the Vice Chancellor, for inviting us here and the Litmus Institute. Dr. Nimer Sultany is not only a very eminent Palestinian scholar, but also a very old friend of mine. And we were class fellows together in a doctoral program some years ago. I won't say quite a few. Dr. Nimer is a leader at SOAS, University of London. He's also the author of Law and Revolution, Legitimacy and Constitutionalism After the Arab Spring, which is a multiple award-winning book. He is a public lawyer, but he also looks at human rights and various aspects of international law. He also specializes, of course, on Palestine, and he is a Palestinian who lives in Israel, but for the last over a decade, he has been on the faculty of SOAS. One particular piece which is very germane to today's conversation is a very important piece, I think, that he's written, an incredibly mind-opening and illuminating piece called The Question of Palestine is a litmus test on human rights and root causes, which was circulated in advance. And if anyone here would like to get that and didn't have access to it, please let us know after the talk. I think it's a fundamental piece to read, to understand the historical context of the current crisis, but also I think it's important at multiple other levels, and we'll hopefully cover many of those themes. So Nimer, I read it pen in hand with bated breath, and I have multiple questions. And some of these questions are more contextual, more topical, and more sort of pertinent to the here and now. But I think the real benefit of having you here is that you can provide us a longer-term historical, constitutional, legal perspective. But before we do a deeper dive into that, I think a lot of people here would be very interested, and I think they are somehow inspired also by what happened at the International Court of Justice. There are those who are more discerning and can see that it's a more complex and multifarious outcome than is normally sort of categorized. Either people see things in terms of success or failure. There's also some despondence that it did not manage to stop the war. If you could kindly start us off by analyzing the context of the case at the International Court of Justice, the South African intervention, and what has happened so far.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really glad to be here at the company of my friend Osama. Thank you also for the organizers and the invitation. As a Palestinian living in London since the 7th of October, it's a very alienating experience when the media is demonizing you, excluding you, Western governments are excluding you, and even anti-war demonstrations in London are deemed as hate protests. And to be here in Pakistan is a rectifying experience. It's a heartening experience, a refreshing experience to be in a welcome space where there's an abundance of acts of solidarity, expressions of solidarity. So thank you, and I'm really overwhelmed by my first visit here in Pakistan. In terms of the question that Osama asked, now one of the mistakes I think that happened immediately after the International Court of Justice issued the provisional orders, there was a lot of focus on the lack of ceasefire order. And in a way, this played into the hand of the Israelis and the Americans who wanted to minimize the effect of the International Court of Justice ruling. So I'm going to take a step back and try to explain why I think the International Court of Justice ruling, and before that the South African application to the court, was momentous, historic, and groundbreaking in many ways. And therefore, it's not reducible to the question of ceasefire. And then I will say something about why I think the ceasefire prism obscures more than illuminates. We need to remember what the 3 months or so before, or 2 months before the South African application to the International Court of Justice looked like. And it was a wall-to-wall political support in the West, Western governments and Western media, for Israel's war. It was depicted as a Hamas attack from an external actor crossing the sovereign border on an unsuspecting Israel. It was presented as violence without context, as irrational in many ways. And what that disappeared is the context of occupation, the context of apartheid, the context of colonialism, and more immediately the context of 16 years of siege, cruel siege over Gaza. So when South Africa submitted its application to the court, as one Palestinian friend of mine said, I felt seen. For the first time since the 7th of October, there was this comprehensive narrative in which that tells what befell the Palestinians in the 7th of October. And it told it in a way that showed the amount of suffering and injustice that has been inflicted on the Palestinians, and more importantly, it provided a context for that outbreak of violence. And they repeated that, obviously, in the oral hearing in the International Court of Justice. You may have heard the South Africans say, this is 75 years of apartheid. This is 56 years of brutal occupation. This is 16 years of siege. And you can't understand what happened, including what is Hamas, without understanding that context. In a way, the South African application and eventually the International Court of Justice ruling cracked the Western media narrative and the pro-Israeli narrative and the Western government's narrative on the war, and the Western mantra that Israel has a right to defend itself. So the court, first of all, ignored completely the question of self-defense. It mentioned that Israel argued in one line, and that's it, it went on. Because as the South African argued in the application itself, it is irrelevant. Even if you have the right to self-defense, that does not give you the legal right to genocide, to commit a genocide. It does not give you a legal right to impose an apartheid. So there are limits in international law, even on the right to self-defense. Secondly, when you remember the context of occupation, the question of self-defense becomes much different. And so the UN Charter, when it talks about self-defense, we're talking about external attack. But in a situation in which there is an occupation and Gaza is occupied, then you can't invoke the right to self-determination, the right to self-defense, because this means that you are trying to perpetuate the occupation through military means. And one of the conceits in the pro-Israeli propaganda is to say that Gaza, since 2005, is not occupied because there was a disengagement plan, the so-called disengagement plan, in which the Israelis since then have no troops on the ground. But if you read any orthodox international legal authority, UN committees, UN commissions, the ICRC, all of them have repeatedly said since 2005 that Israel continues to be the occupier of Gaza. And the fact, as you all have seen, the fact that Israel has the ability to switch water, fuel, and all the basic amenities on Gaza tells you how much control they have over the small and densely populated territory. So when the South Africans invoked context, because you need to remember that when people like me invoked context in the 2 months before that, we were called terrorists or supporters of terrorism, just trying to invoke. The second thing that the South African application and then the International Court of Justice have done is that they backed up all of those of us who have argued since the middle of October that this is a genocide. We were dismissed and the Western were dismissed by Western governments. And then even when South Africa applied to the Court of Justice, they were also dismissed. You might remember different governments like the UK, the US, Canada, Germany saying we think this is without foundation, we disagree with the premise, it's meritless, etc. And then the International Court of Justice says, well, no, actually there is a risk of genocide here. Now what this means is it puts to notice every single country in the world that is a party to the Genocide Convention that they have a duty, according to the Genocide Convention, to prevent genocide. So all countries now are required to do anything that they can, in political means, economic means, etc., to assist the Palestinians against the genocide, to try to pressure Israel to stop the genocide. All the countries and the media in the West that have uncritically supported Israel war now find themselves that they have been supporting a genocide, possibly, and that they have aided and abetted a genocide. And this is again a violation of the Genocide Convention. So all these countries, like the US in particular, but also Germany and the UK, can now, if the court finds that this is a genocide in the merits stage in a few years' time, they can all be held accountable for their support for genocide. The question of ceasefire. Now, I think one of the difficulties is that there were high expectations from the court, and there was little understanding of the limitations of courts generally, and the International Court of Justice in particular. As you know, courts don't have the sword nor the purse, so in many ways they rely on others to enforce their rulings. In the case of the International Court of Justice, they will have to rely on the UN Security Council to enforce their rulings. And I assume the judges, like the rest of us, have seen 3 months of the UN Security Council and the UN unable to order a ceasefire or to stop a ceasefire. And as you know, the United Nations Security Council is the highest legal authority in the UN system. So had the International Court of Justice issued a ceasefire order, and then it was blocked, as would be expected to be blocked by the US and the other Western countries on the 5 veto power council, then the court will expose its weakness. You could also assume that the court would have been attacked in its legitimacy, would have been delegitimized by the Israelis and their supporters, because the ceasefire would have looked like that one side of the conflict and not on the other side. So in the case of, in previous genocide cases, the Gambia versus Myanmar case, there was no ceasefire. It's a genocide case. This is not a situation like in Russia versus Ukraine, Ukraine versus Russia, of two regular armies engaged in ordinary war or conflict. So in a way, to call it a conflict and to exaggerate the abilities of Hamas is to produce the misconception that this is not a situation of a gross asymmetry of power in a situation of occupation. In the case of Ukraine versus Russia, there was a ceasefire, but again, this was not like a situation of genocide, as we have in the case of Myanmar and the case of Palestine. And again, both parties were before the court. Hamas was not before the court. So I assume the court would have been criticized. And in any case, when you read these rulings, we have 17 judges, and 15 of them agreed on the provisional measures. They will usually look for the lowest common denominator and the thinnest ground that allows a larger consensus. The ceasefire prism, in my view, obscures reality in these two ways. One, which I just mentioned, the question of gross asymmetry of power. And secondly, it also obscures the idea that the international legal obligations are, Israel has to abide by these obligations whether there is a ceasefire or not. So if you remember the 24th of November, when we had about a week of a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, one of the achievements of the ceasefire was the entry of some medical aid and humanitarian aid. But a few years ago, about 5 years ago, the UN Security Council said that you cannot use starvation and unlawfully impeding humanitarian aid as a method of warfare. So regardless of the existence of the ceasefire, Israel should not be using starvation, should not be cutting off water and fuel and all these basic amenities. Now, when it comes to the actual measures that the court has decided, the Israelis and the Americans were saying, well, this is what we have been doing, and there is nothing that needs to change in light of the court. And again, this is the pro-Israeli propaganda. In fact, if you look at these rulings, there is no way for Israel to implement the provisional measures without radically scaling down their military operations. So, for example, the court said you need to allow effective and humanitarian aid. Now, before they said that, in the narrative that preceded the provisional orders, they said the Israelis claim that they are already allowing some aid. We think this is not convincing. We think this is not sufficient. So they already said that whatever the Israelis are doing is not compliant with the order that we are issuing now, and the Israelis will have to. And they also quoted the UN officials who said you cannot have effective and immediate aid with the ongoing bombardment, with the ongoing massive military onslaught. So there is no way to understand, in my view, this particular provisional measure without asking Israel to radically de-escalate. So in a way, it's effectively a ceasefire. Another provisional measure is the one that says you cannot produce conditions that are calculated to bring about the physical destruction of a significant part of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And again, before that provisional measure, the court said there's this famine and there's this massive displacement of the Palestinians. So again, there's no way to say that what Israel now is doing with respect to Rafah, where you have more than 1 million refugees in the last, basically, what used to be the last relatively safe haven for the displaced. And they are asking again to displace all of these people and with no place to go. So again, there is no way to understand that without saying that Israel has to radically scale down its military operations in order to be in compliance with the International Court of Justice. One final thing I want to say that I think is significant in the proceedings and then the ruling of the court is what we can describe as a global south versus global north kind of dynamics. So this former colonized nation that they have been inflicted, the Afrikaners have inflicted upon them apartheid for decades. And now they are coming to the aid in an act of solidarity of the Palestinians, another colonized nation under apartheid as well. And then Western countries that have aided and abetted Israel's impunity, and provided Israel with the arms to kill the Palestinian children, men and women, and displace them, are like Germany, Canada, the US, and the UK, have objected to the South African application, and some of them, like Germany, have even said, like a day or two before the ICJ ruled on the provisional measures, that they are going to intervene in the case in support of Israel's lands. And then once the Germans said that, Namibia, a former colonized nation, called out Germany for the genocide they themselves inflicted on the Namibians in the early 1900s. So this also creates a new dynamic in terms of international law and its aspirations to be universal and its claims to be inclusive. But also makes us think, why is genocide recognized only after World War II, when Europeans slaughtered Europeans, while the colonial genocides that preceded the 1948 are not recognized in our legal and academic culture and processes as genocide as well. So I think this will be an opportunity as well for us to, from a kind of a global South perspective, to review these kind of blind spots of the international law generally, and also to try to galvanize the global South to make international law accountable and to make the UN institutions in particular accountable for their failures. And also it might be a chance, despite the suffering and injustice, to rethink the UN system. Because obviously the fact that there are 5 states that are able to veto any ability to accountability for themselves, be held accountable for themselves or their friends, creates a situation in which some states are above international law and they can do whatever they want.
Thank you. Nimer, I have a whole bunch of reactions to what you just said. It's a very rich narrative. The first thing which emerges is obviously how complex this terrain of international politics, global imperatives, international law, the particular history of International Court of Justice, and how easy it is to take away the impression that just because there wasn't a ceasefire, without understanding the inherent institutional limitations which make that very difficult and maybe even counterproductive. And how, in many ways, there is a certain visibility, a certain voice, which has now been lent to a lot of things, as you said, which have been voiced by the Palestinians for the longest time. So in that sense, this creates a whole new arsenal and also provides the possibility of a strategy to approach this question afresh. I think in many ways you've also, hinted at and spoken about the depoliticization and the dehistoricization of the question of Palestine, right? And how often, and we'll get to deconstructing law, because law has this entire aura of being the appropriate terrain, and yet law is a very problematic terrain. 2 things here, and you can take them in whichever sequence you want, or one by one. One is really that when we talk about depoliticization and dehistoricization, and that's a big part of your piece as well, it would be useful to just very sort of quickly, I guess, highlight some of the key moments in what is not a 6-month-old struggle or a 2-year-old struggle, but almost a century-year-old struggle, with multiple violations of international law and human rights taking place and the impunity which has come out. And one of the things you really talk about is the necessity of recognizing Zionism as a form of colonialism. And unless and until you widen the perspective and you look at it from that lens, you don't really appreciate how pernicious it is, how all-encompassing, and how it is necessary to look for a solution or a fight back which is not purely legal. And I think I have a lot of follow-up questions on that as well, but just to further introduce the themes both of depoliticization and dehistoricization and Zionism as a form, the most advanced form perhaps of colonialism.
Yeah, with respect to your initial comment about arsenal, I think this is the correct word. So when others were despondent about the lack of ceasefire order, what I saw in the ruling on provisional measures, something I can capitalize on, that it can invigorate anti-war mobilizations and Western capitals, that it can make Western officials now much more reticent to go for photo ops with Israeli officials that are now cited as making genocidal statements by the International Court of Justice. It can capitalize legal activists in London and in the US and elsewhere to take their own respective governments to the court with respect to arms trade with Israel, with respect to other kind of complicity in the genocidal war. It can galvanize the BDS, Worker Divestment and Sanctions activists in Western campuses in London and elsewhere. So we tend to think a lot of one side of the equation, which is how politics affects law, and which is of course proper, but also we need to think of how law can shape politics. So a bad ruling would have been bad to the Palestinians if the court did not issue any provisional measure against Israel. This would be a green lighting genocide in legal terms. And things would have been much worse than now. But in that sense, I think in the kind of political sphere, when you want to build up a movement and you want to find the strength in different elements. So this court ruling can be a moment, text that can be capitalized on. In terms of the context, obviously there is the kind of larger context and then there's the more immediate context. So I'll try to say something about Zionism and colonialism, and then I'll say something about the 16-year siege and Hamas in particular. One of the important, I think, important insights of the ruling of the court, again, is to say there can be no exception to Israeli genocide. So Israel has no exception to commit genocide, or to that is not exempted from the duty to prevent genocide. Because traditionally, at least in Western discourse, Israel has been, and Zionism has been basically an exception to colonialism. So this is a colonialism we like. This is a colonialism that we don't denigrate. And this is an apartheid we support, as opposed to previous apartheids. If you look at the the Israeli policies over the years, from the standpoint of those who are living under the Israeli regime, what we see is that the Palestinians are of different groups, obviously. 2/3 of the Palestinians are refugees. They live in Lebanon, Syria, or Jordan, refugee camps. And some of these refugees are refugees in the West Bank and Gaza. These refugees were produced by the 1948 Nakba, or what we call, the South Africans indeed called in their court the ongoing Nakba, because the Nakba is not only a process of displacement, mass displacement, but also a process of ongoing land grab and making the lives of the natives so difficult that they would have either to leave or to accept their inferior status. And the second group of the Palestinians are those who live in the West Bank and Gaza, and also East Jerusalem, although East Jerusalem has a little bit of a different status because it's annexed under Israeli law. Obviously, this is illegal, but you don't hear anyone in the West saying anything about this illegal annexation, while all of them are happy to talk about the illegality of the annexation of the Crimea by Russia. Again, another example of the double standards and hypocrisy. And then the final group of the Palestinians is the one who live inside Israel and who are citizens, but are not equal citizens. And if you look at the ways in which Israel controls all these Palestinians, you see that it's one system of domination, one system of supremacy and segregation and discrimination, but to varying degrees. Obviously, the most difficult are, in a way, the refugees who are excluded totally from the homeland and they live poorly in these refugee camps. But also in recent years, as Gaza, that has been subjected to, since 2000, to several major military onslaughts by Israel, and then the siege of 16 years, which we'll come to. So briefly, in 1948, as you know, the UN General Assembly recommended partition of Palestine into two states, one Jewish state, one Arab state. The native indigenous Palestinian Arabs obviously rejected that partition because if you read the discourse in the UN Assembly and also those who were part of the partition committee, you will see that it was a very colonialist mindset in which they wanted to ship the Jewish problem from outside Europe and to impose it on another nation's homeland at the expense of that nation with no regard for their interests, for their wishes, for their desire. As you know, Palestine was occupied by the British in 1917, and soon afterwards, Britain was given the mandate over Palestine. Now, if you go back to the system mandate of the League of Nations, it was clearly colonialist. So I can't remember the number of the article, might have been 23. In any case, that article said clearly there are less developed nations and there are more developed nations, and the less developed nations are not ready for the benefit of freedom.
We are never ready.
Yes, it's a work in progress. And then there are those nations, strong nations, advanced nations that will serve as the tutors for the less advanced nations. So the whole area in the Middle East, so Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine, and also Egypt were under the British tutelage, and then the French were also mandatory power in Syria and Lebanon. And one of the peculiarities of the British mandate, so this is bad enough, but the Palestine mandate was even worse, as the British themselves, like Lord Balfour and others have said repeatedly, than other places, because these mandates were at least nominally trying to prepare these nations for the eventual independence, the right to self-determination. And except, Lord Balfour says, Palestine. Why? Because Palestine in the Palestine mandate, they included a Jewish establishment of a Jewish national home. And obviously, at the time of the mandate, the Jews in Palestine were a minority of the population. And throughout the mandate, what the British were doing is that they are allowing mass immigration to Palestine. And they were preventing any form of representation for the community. So the Palestinians were saying things like, no taxation without representation, which is like an American Revolution slogan, as you may remember. But the British and the Zionists were consistently denying the Palestinians that right, because they know if the will of the people, the role of the many, the wishes of the majority were listened to, they would say, no, we don't want to be displaced, we don't want to be overwhelmed by European settlers who will come here and take our lands and control us. Where everyone is welcome as a refugee or as an immigrant, but an organized colonial movement that want to create a political structure that also denies you the right to self-determination is something no one would agree to, obviously. And the British in that period have done their share amount of ruthlessly repressing Palestinian resistance to what the Palestinians could see as encroaching project that seeks to take their land from under their feet and deny them any form of political representation. There is a famous quote also by Churchill at the time in which he said something like, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, and first of all, he compared the Palestinians in Palestine to the native nations in the US, in North America. And he said, I don't admit that the dog in the manger, no matter how long they laid there, is entitled to the land. There is a higher race that is coming from Europe, and they are the ones who are, have the right to the land. So, and Lord Balfour said something similar in which Zionism, whether it's right or wrong, has the support of the Western powers at the time, and it's much more important than the prejudices and the biases and the ignorance of the indigenous population. So there was a total disregard of the Palestinians were not asked about the mandate, they were not asked about the Lord Balfour Declaration before that promised Palestine to the Zionists, and they were not asked also about the partition. In fact, if you go back, there's a famous text that is available online. There is a commission that Woodrow Wilson, the American president, sent to Palestine in 1919 called the King-Crane Commission. So King and Crane, the commissioners said in their report, we came here with Zionist sympathies. We were sympathetic to the Zionist cause. But when we toured the country and we talked to everyone and we listened to what's happening, we became aware of the grave injustice that is being inflicted on the indigenous people of this land. And the only way for the Jewish National Home policy to be implemented is only through force. And that is indeed what happened. There was a famous Arab revolt in the second half of the 1930s for about 3 years when the Palestinians were trying to stop the colonial project by the British and the Zionists, and the ruthless measures that the British employed, burning villages, bombing them from the air, exiling the leadership, is a direct consequence for the fact that in 1948 the Palestinians were defeated because their leadership is not there, their resistance has been decimated in many ways. In any case, 1948 produced this wave of refugees, and then 1967 also produced another wave of refugees. In 1967, Israel waged a war on several Arab countries, and the West Bank and Gaza at the time were under the Jordanian control and the Egyptian control, respectively. And that war is now considered in the literature as illegal war in the same way that the Iraq war could be considered, the American war in Iraq could be considered illegal because it was considered like a preemptive strike. There was no real danger to Israel when they invoked it. And obviously, they exaggerated the threat from the Arab states, and then we saw in like 6 days, they destroyed the Arab armies and controlled many more Arab Palestinian territories. And since then, they imposed a military government on the West Bank and Gaza. Now, I need to say something also very quickly. After 1948, about 156 Palestinians remained within the territory of Israel. Israel has destroyed over 450 Palestinian towns and villages. Many Palestinian towns became depopulated. In some of the cities like Led and Haifa, where a little bit of population remained, they ghettoized these populations. Like in Haifa, they concentrated all the Arabs in 2 streets, one for the Christians and one for the Muslims. And they had wires around these neighborhoods for a couple of years. And then they imposed on the Palestinians inside Israel, who are nominally citizens, because Israel was also applying to become a member of the United Nations at the time. So they needed to show that they are slightly compliant with international law. And they even promised that they will allow some form of freedom of refugees. In any case, they imposed a military government on those who are citizens. So for about 20 years, since 1948, they imposed a military government system. What that means is that you can't leave your hometown without a permit from the military governor of the area. There's a lot of repression of any kind of speech or political activity. But what I'm invoking this only to remind you what is the crux of the apartheid regime in South Africa. It is what is called the pass permit regime. So the fact that you, in order to move in your country, your movement is controlled through this permit regime. And in addition, obviously, there was a residential segregation and educational segregation, which continues still this day.
So Dania Shibli novel also captures that past regime very well, because it's all about the journey within the country, so it's also kind of a fiction in that sense. Yeah.
Indeed, and I'm mentioning this only to remember that, to remind you that when we talk about apartheid, some organizations like Human Rights Watch, we focus only on the West Bank and Gaza and say this is the apartheid, while organizations like Amnesty International say no, apartheid is in all over the territory. Now, of course, Human Rights Watch says, like many other committees, that also inside Israel there is institutionalized racial discrimination. In any event, going back to 1967, so there's another wave of refugees, and there's a brutal occupation that is being imposed on the Palestinians. Now, as you know, in the 1990s, there was an Oslo process, a kind of a peace-making process in which the Palestinians said we recognize Israel, we're going to renounce violence, and the Israelis allowed the Palestinians to go back to Gaza and some parts of the West Bank. Now this process was supposed to lead by 1999 to a state. Obviously it hasn't happened. And not only that, the Palestinians saw that the Israelis are not serious about peace, because you can't negotiate with me over the land while you are building more settlements and bringing more settlers on the land. How are these people going to leave? We're talking about hundreds of thousands of settlers in the West Bank and around Jerusalem in a way that will make the division of Jerusalem not practical. I mean, the Israelis had a lot of difficulty removing the few settlements with the few settlers in Gaza in 2005. Imagine what, and this is in part because the initial vision of the Oslo process was not to give the Palestinian any form of state, but some form of very limited autonomy in which the Palestinians, which they have become in the West Bank, become a subcontractor for the occupation. So the Israelis do not have the direct control over the Palestinian population. They don't have to deal with their daily needs. Because under international law, if you are an occupying force, you need to take care of the law and order in the territory, you need to take care of the basic needs. And you can't use the territory for your own interests. You can't use their resources for your own interests. And this, again, is one of the reasons why many would see a colonial aspect in this. Because Israel is exploiting the resources and is bringing colonial settlers into the West Bank. But even with the accommodating authority in Ramallah, led by Fatah, the Israelis have not been able to reach a peace agreement. The current Palestinian so-called president, of course he hasn't been elected for since 2009, I think, is the best Palestinian that the Israelis can wish for, and yet they haven't been able to have an agreement with him. In the last 10 years, there were no negotiations at all. In part, this is also because of the increasing strength of the right wing in Israel. So Benjamin Netanyahu came to power in 1996, and even then, till 1999, he was trying to sabotage the Oslo process. And since then, with like a 1 year of left-to-center rule in Israel, there has been a right-wing or far-right governments in Israel, including the settlers becoming much more, the settlers of the West Bank, becoming much more influential in Israeli politics and Israeli law, including, for example, judges sitting on the Supreme Court in Israel. So this also gives you a perspective about Hamas and Gaza, because the question is not, Hamas as being, radical or etc. Because the Fatah and the West Bank is not radical, and yet the Israelis have not been able to even negotiate and speak to them. They have been unwilling to give them any kind of concessions that would show, peace-building measures of some sort. Now, what happened with Hamas is interesting because there's a lot of demonization and dehumanization of Hamas, and then more generally the Palestinians and Gazans in particular. As many of you know, probably, Hamas was against the Oslo process in the beginning, and they had suicide bombings in Israel and all that stuff. But in 2005, 2006, they participated in the elections within the Oslo process, within the electoral system that the Oslo process created. They wanted to integrate into the political system. And what was the response of Israel, the US, the EU? The response was to support a Gaza strongman from Fatah to stage a coup against Hamas and try to dislodge them from power. Hamas reacted, and since then we have two governments, one in the West Bank and one in Gaza. Now what followed since then was Israel imposing a siege, a cruel siege on the Palestinians, including what kind of food or pasta can enter or tomato sauce can enter the territory. Total control. What kind of labor movement?
It's a remarkably sort of detailed and completely nonsensical list of what can go in and what. It just shows the amount of control which is exerted on everyday life.
Yeah, bureaucracy in very, and it's extreme cruelty. And there's like many articles in the Hebrew press about this military unit called Kogat that was in control of this, how they decided in a very arbitrary way what kind of food people can eat in Gaza. And if you read the kind of reports by the UN and others, you see that there's a lot of talk about stunting. The fact that people are malnutrition, and therefore they do not grow, especially kids, they don't grow in the same, like naturally they should, because they're not getting the food they should. In 2012, there was a report by UN committee that said, by 2020, Gaza will be unlivable. So now we are in 2023, and Israel is doing more to make Gaza not only unlivable, but also there's nowhere to return to, given the scale of destruction. Now, if you look again, it's all in the Israeli press, and that's why it's sometimes surprising how easy in the Western media and Western governments to demonize Hamas. If you look at the Haaretz website and you Google Hamas ceasefire, you'll find several articles from 2016 and 2017 that say Hamas offered Israel a long-term ceasefire, and that Hamas said to Israel that we agree to the 1967 borders. Which is basically accepting the two-state solution. There was a document that Hamas wrote in 2017, which is kind of a charter that updated their earlier documents. And it says we distinguish between Jews and Zionists. Our problem is not with Jews, our problem is with the Zionist entity. Our problem is with the occupation, our problem is with the apartheid. And we want to resist that form of subjugation. So all of these obviously are, erased from the narrative because, if you are nuanced, it will not be easy to demonize Hamas and demonize the action by the Palestinians. And then there was even, I think 2018, there was a letter that Hamas sent to Benjamin Netanyahu in Hebrew, trying to initiate some form of it. But the Israelis were not interested in any of this. They wanted the Palestinians to die in their own enclave, in the ghetto, that is Gaza, under inhumane conditions. And they also wanted the Palestinian prisoners, thousands and thousands of Palestinian prisoners, to languish in prison. I started visiting as a lawyer, a human rights lawyer. I started visiting Palestinian prisoners in 1999. And I did that for many years. Many of these prisoners are still in prison. Oh. They've been there for like 20 years when I started visiting them. They are still in prison. When you hear the demand by the Western media and the Western governments about the urgency of releasing hostages, Israeli hostages, Hamas, you feel like, why there is no urgency for Palestinian freedom? Why are these prisoners languishing 30 years in prison and no one is asking for their immediate release? Some of them are children. Some of them are, because of the harshness of the military orders, which is the legal tool in which the Israeli military controls the West Bank. And some of them, and many of them are there for years without a trial, without any form of trial. So when you consider all of this, the mantra of Israel is a democracy and the only democracy in the Middle East is just laughable. How can